I didn't start packing when they told me to leave. I started when my father stopped asking me questions months ago. By the time my mother said, "You should take what's yours and go," I already knew what yours meant. It didn't include the house. It didn't include the inheritance. It barely included a place in the room. So when I folded my clothes into the bag, it wasn't rushed. It was methodical. I chose things I had paid for myself. Things I could account for. Things that wouldn't be argued over. Behind me, my sister stood near the doorway, not speaking. She looked uncomfortable, but not surprised. That part mattered more than anything. No one was surprised. The number had already been said earlier. 10 million. It sounded abstract when my father said it, like he was discussing a business decision instead of a person's future. He didn't look at me when he explained it had been reassigned, as if I had been an administrative error. I didn't ask why. Not because I didn't care, but because I had already run through the possible answers in my head long before this day. None of them would sound different out loud. My mother hovered closer as I zipped the bag. "Leave the watch," she said. I looked at her, then at my wrist. It wasn't expensive. It was a gift from my grandfather, the same man who had set up the inheritance. For a second, I almost laughed at the irony. "I'm taking what's mine," I said. That was when her voice changed. "You're not taking anything from here. Hand over the bag." There's a moment when a situation crosses a line you didn't realize was still negotiable. This was that moment. I held on to the strap. No, it wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. My father moved before I could react. His hand gripped the back of my hair, sudden and impersonal, like he was removing something stuck rather than touching his own child. The force pulled me off balance, and the bag slipped, hitting the floor with a dull sound. There was no shouting after that. Just movement. The hallway. The door. The brief flash of outside light. And then I was on the ground. The door closed with a firmness that felt practiced. For a few seconds I didn't move. Not because I was hurt, but because I needed to understand what had just finalized itself. Across the street, a neighbor pretended to adjust something on their porch. I picked up the bag. When I stood, I looked at the house not dramatically, not for closure, just to confirm something. No one came back to the door. That's when I said it, not loudly, not even expecting them to hear clearly through the wood. "You're going to regret this." It wasn't a threat. It was an observation I had been sitting with for weeks. Then I left. The first place I stayed was temporary. Everything was temporary at first: rooms, routines, conversations. There's a quiet that comes after being removed from a place you were supposed to belong to. Not relief, not grief, just absence. I didn't contact them. They didn't contact me. Days passed, then weeks, and in that time, something became clearer, not about them, but about the inheritance itself. My grandfather had been precise. Not affectionate, not expressive, but precise. He documented everything. Conversations, intentions, conditions. I used to think it was just habit. It wasn't. It was structure. I started reading what I had access to. Old emails. Copies of documents he'd insisted I keep, even when I didn't understand why. At the time, it had felt excessive. Now it felt deliberate. There were inconsistencies. Not dramatic ones, subtle ones, dates that didn't align, language that had been altered slightly, enough to raise questions, not emotional ones but procedural ones. So I did something my parents never expected me to do. I stopped reacting and started verifying. The office was quiet, neutral, the kind of place where tone doesn't matter, only facts. The man across from me didn't know my family. He didn't care about our history. He only cared about what could be proven. He read through the documents slowly. Then he asked a few questions. Not many. Finally, he leaned back slightly. "This wasn't transferred properly," he said. That was it. No drama, no shock, just a statement. But everything shifted in that sentence. Because what my parents had treated as final wasn't. There were steps missing, authorizations incomplete, conditions that hadn't been met or had been bypassed, not illegal in an obvious way, but not valid either. And that meant something very simple. The control they thought they had didn't fully exist. The letters went out without emotion, formal, clear, unavoidable, requests for clarification, notices of review, requirements to present documentation. Authority has a way of entering a situation quietly but becoming impossible to ignore once it's there. I wasn't present when my parents received them. I don't know what was said in that house when they realized something had shifted, but I know what happens when certainty disappears. It doesn't explode. It erodes. They reached out eventually, not with apologies, not at first, with questions. Then, with confusion. Then, with a tone I hadn't heard before. Not quite regret, not quite concern, but something closer to instability. Like they were trying to locate ground that wasn't where they left it. I didn't respond immediately. When I did, it was brief, controlled. I wasn't interested in re-arguing the past, only in clarifying the present. The outcome didn't restore everything. That was never realistic, but it corrected enough. Enough to undo the assumption that I could be removed without consequence. Enough to establish that what had been dismissed still held weight. I didn't go back to the house. There was a moment where I could have. A meeting was suggested. A discussion I declined. Not out of anger, just clarity. What stayed with me wasn't the money. It was the realization that the decision to erase me hadn't started that day, it had just become visible. And what I rebuilt afterward wasn't a replacement for that loss. It was something separate. Something they didn't give. Something they couldn't take. The last message I received from my mother was short. We didn't expect this. I read it once, then put my phone down, because neither had I. But that didn't change what was already true.